Hi, everyone. So this is a simple video about what non-duality is, or rather, what precisely is non-dual, what is not two. So the word non-duality is formed on the basis of the Sanskrit term Advaita, commonly mispronounced Advaita, but it's actually Advaita. And that at the beginning is a negating prefix. So it's not two or not two-ness, Advaita. And so non-duality is a view of the nature of reality that argues that two things that appear to be two are really not two at the deeper level. They are actually one. So there's different views about what exactly are, in fact, not two, but one. So I'm going to explore those briefly, and I hope this will clear things up for you if you've not been crystal clear about this issue. And please do share this video with friends. So first, God and self. There are many spiritual traditions, especially in South Asia, the Indian subcontinent, that argue that these appear to be two, but they're not really two, God and the self. And this is sometimes phrased in other sorts of language, like Atman, the self, and Paramatman, the supreme self. But it really boils down to the identity of your true nature with universal consciousness, with the universal beingness that makes the whole universe possible. Now, what might this actually mean in direct experience? Because nowadays I'm not so interested in philosophy as what can be discovered in direct experience. So can we discover in direct experience that there's a non-duality of God and the self? Well, yes, depending on what you mean by the word God. So if God is absolutely unbounded, unlimited, unparticularized consciousness that is trans-individual, meaning to say it transcends all particular individuals while also making the consciousness of those individuals possible, then we can establish this identity. Obviously, if you think God refers to a superhuman, supernatural being who lives in heaven, a person, as it were, that made the world, then we can't establish that identity. Then the most you can say is that man was made in God's image, right? But indeed, the Indian spiritual traditions, some of them anyway, argue for this identity because of the way that they define self and because of the way that they define God. So really simply, yourself is not your identity. So yourself doesn't inhere in your body, in your gender, in your ethnicity, in your biography, your memories of your past. It doesn't inhere in your personality traits. All these are ephemeral and relatively superficial compared to your real self, which is being, awareness, presence. I like to use those three terms because we could use one, but it might not capture as well what we're talking about. So being, awareness, presence. This is your true nature according to these South Asian schools of thought. And this is easily verifiable in direct experience because it's that aspect of yourself, that aspect of your experience of reality, which is constant. So this feeling of being preceded all your self-images, It preceded all your conscious memories. It preceded your formation of identity. If you think back to when you were 3 or 4 years old and just, wide-eyed looking out at this world, not understanding anything, not having an idea of yourself, if you can remember what it felt like to be that little 3-year-old version or 4-year-old version, then you can feel the same beingness is here now. It never ages, right? So that's one way to point towards it very simply, and it works for most people, just doesn't work for those who had a traumatic time at those ages. And we specifically pick those ages because they are before the formation of identity and self-images, but sadly for some people not before trauma. So for those folks, we need to do various meditation practices that enable them to see, or rather feel, that aspect of their own beingness which was never traumatized, which is not wounded or damaged in any way, right? Because your beingness can't be damaged. It's impossible. Only the body-mind can carry wounds of various kinds that don't impinge upon your real nature. So being, awareness, presence, you can put slashes in there if you like, or dashes. It is absolutely pure. It's untouched, untainted, we might say, by all the experiences. It's pure because it can't not be pure. Right? It's nothing but the awareness of your own being, and being that awareness. So it's almost impossible to really accurately put into words. But once you investigate through meditative practice this being, awareness, presence more deeply, you discover that it's not a self, that it makes all experience possible, and that it's incredibly intimate. It's the only aspect of experience which is simultaneously right on the surface of things and deeper than anything else. So we have this idea that discovering our true nature, we have to delve down deep, deep, deep. And that's true. To discover the actual depth of what you are, you need to delve down deep. But what you are is also immediately present. It's right here, right now. It can't not be, because it's what you are. So it's that which is present when there is no thought, and that which is present when there is thought. Right? So if you compare these two states, thought-free and thinking, and compare free of emotion and emotional, notice what's there in both contexts. Okay, so it's that which makes cognition possible, though it's not delimited by cognition. Okay, so you discover there's not a self to this, and it's somehow simultaneously intimate, but it transcends every idea you have of self. Okay, and so then these traditions argue that this consciousness, this awareness that you've discovered as your very own being, is in fact trans-individual. In fact, it's that which gives rise to experience and supports experience and receives the dissolution of all forms of experience, right? So this that you are is the ground of being. It's, again, the source of the experience of phenomena, right? No experience isn't possible without consciousness. You could even argue that they're simply synonymous, awareness or consciousness on the one hand, and experiencing on the other, are just different terms for the same thing. fact of experiencing, right? So it's really impossible to prove this, but as you go deeper into experiencing that which you are, you discover that it fits the definition of God, at least in some spiritual traditions, because what you are is unlimited. Your awareness is not constrained in any way. It's radically open, autonomous, free, and needs nothing outside of itself. And these are characteristics of what we might call divinity, right? And also being the ground of being, the source of phenomena, the support of phenomena, and that into which phenomena once again dissolve also corresponds to the definition of God in some traditions, okay? So, of course, the non-duality of self and God is only possible to establish in direct experience or philosophically, given certain definitions of those terms, right? And so there's no point in arguing about this with people who don't agree with your definitions of those key terms, because you're arguing past each other, right? Okay, non-duality number 2. What else is not two but appears to be two? Self and other. Yourself and other humans. Okay, this is the second not two-ness I want to address. So on the body-mind level, of course, you're different from other humans. How different? Well, the differences might seem to be big to you, but to aliens, they would be incredibly minute differences, superficial differences, right? We exaggerate our own sense of difference for all sorts of cultural reasons, and even capitalism encourages us to do that. And so we overlook the fact that we share much, much, much more in common than the ways in which we differ. So each of these body minds is as unique as a snowflake, but all snowflakes are made of water. And even more so, all snowflakes have a generally similar pattern, right? Snowflakes are completely symmetrical, for example, and they form concentric patterns, and so each one is unique, but also if you zoom out a bit, they're kind of all the same, right? And so human body minds are very much like that. But what about that which looks through your eyes? Okay, because the body mind is all that can be observed about you. Personality traits, behavior patterns, thoughts, feelings, and so on. But that which looks through the body mind is not directly observable by anyone else, only by you. And even you can't actually observe what you are, just like you can never step on the shadow of your own head, right? Just like you can never see your own eyeballs. You can feel and sense and be what you are, what you fundamentally are. You can't directly observe it, and certainly nobody else can. So it doesn't occur to us most of the time to realize that that which is looking through these eyes is that which is looking through all the eyes that exist. So we overlook that because the body minds are different, but the body mind is what is being looked through. And we're talking here about that which is looking. And when we immerse in our true nature, that being, awareness, presence, then we can talk with others who have also immersed in it, and we discover, oh my gosh, there's no difference. We might notice certain qualities it has more than others. Somebody might notice other qualities, but that's all the same qualities, right? Whether we're talking about its openness, its stillness, its hosting quality, right? We can name these things in different ways, but this being awareness presence that we are, whatever you choose to call it, essence nature, Buddha nature, Atman, it doesn't matter. We discover that it's actually the same as the essence nature of everyone else. So what's looking through these eyes right now, and what's looking through your eyes watching this video, it's the same one. So even if you don't agree with calling it God, as I was previously, we can establish through direct experience and communion with others, real communion that goes past these mental categories, that it's the same one looking out of all of these pairs of eyes. And that fact only is obscured by identification with that which we are looking through. Okay, so that is perhaps the most important non-duality to be aware of. It depends who you ask. Okay, so the third non-duality I want to address, the third version of not two-ness, concerns subject and object. Okay, so the subject is you, the knower. The object is whatever is known, whatever is cognized, whether that's a thought, an emotion, a sound, a visual image, a sensation, and so on. So there would appear to be quite a gulf between these two. Knower and known seem to be very different. The knower is formless, right? It's that same awareness presence, though that fact can be obscured by the appearance of something like a mind. That is to say, we often make the mistake of thinking that the mind is the knower. But the mind is not the knower. The mind is actually a tool. We have a mental faculty which we can use for certain kinds of knowing, like mathematics, for example. We need to use the mind to solve math problems, right? But the mind is the tool we use to solve the problem. It's not the knower. Okay. So being awareness presence, that is the knower. And it seems to be quite different from the known, again, because it's not particularized. It's uncategorizable, pure knowing presence. And objects are things. They're pots, and they are plants, and they are clouds, and they are bricks, and so on. And these are particular objects, right? But this dichotomy actually breaks down when you go far enough in the meditative endeavor, the spiritual practice, right? So how does it break down? Well, in this simple way. In contemplating, for example, you're hearing a sound. You're sitting in meditation, hearing a sound. And you realize that only when the mind intervenes do there appear to be two things, a hearer and something heard, or even three things, hearer, hearing, and heard. That seems to be true from the perspective of the linguistically conditioned thinking mind. But in direct experience, in pre-verbal, we might say, or non-verbal direct experience, that's not true at all. There's just hearing, or maybe you prefer to say there's just sound. It doesn't actually matter how you label it, but the point is that you discover for yourself, you must discover for yourself, that there is no hearer separate from the hearing, and there is no heard separate from the hearing. Or if you prefer to call it sound, you can say there is no hearing separate from sound, and there is no hearer that is separate except as a thought, right? So you have to look carefully and see that if you imagine yourself as a hearer separate from what's heard, you can make believe, you can effectively make believe that that is the case. But let me put the challenge in this way. When you're hearing a sound, look to see if there is a hearer separate from the hearing existing as anything other than a thought. And you will find that the only version of a hearer separate from hearing is the one you dream into existence, right? The imagined separate self. You think a self that is distinct from the hearing. But if you drop that thought, if you can drop that thought even for a moment, then you're able to be intimate with the fact that there's just hearing, which we could say is a vibration of consciousness. And the reason I want to rephrase it in that way is so we can shift to the other senses. And then you can notice, oh, sensation. There's no feeler or sensor separate from the sensing. And there's nothing sensed separate from the sensing. There's just sensation, which is another vibration of consciousness. And then you can go through all the senses in this way and see, oh, visual imagery is just color, or see, whether you call it seeing or color doesn't matter, right? And there's no seer separate from the seeing, except the one you imagine into existence. There's just seeing. But we don't advise that you start, myself and other non-dual teachers, don't advise that you start with seeing, because it's where the illusion of separate self is strongest. You have to start with the other senses and then get there, and then you'll be able to see. The same thing applies. There is no difference, in fact. And there's no thinker separate from the thinking, right? There's just thinking. So in this way, you discover that there is no subject-object dichotomy, because what appears to be an object is the subject vibrating in a particular way, vibrating as those sensations, those sounds, those colors, etc., those flavors, those smells, those thoughts. So this takes some introspective work, we might say. You need to really take time to see for yourself that the dichotomy of subject and object is actually illusory. You need to drill down on that for yourself. Don't take anyone's word for it, because then you won't have the actual realization. You won't have the actual awakening that's life-changing. So it doesn't do you any good to believe that there is no subject-object dichotomy. You need to actually see it, sense it, be it, feel it, it needs to be radically experiential. Okay, so that's 3 non-dualities so far: God and self, self and other, subject and object. So in all 3, there's been, a version of the self that's part of the non-duality. And remember, we say non-duality instead of oneness because there do appear to be 2 when actually there's 1 at a deeper level, right? So there appears to be self versus other, or subject versus object. And then deeper investigation reveals there's not. And then for the final non-duality I want to address, here it's a different kind of non-duality, because self isn't involved, right, or subjectivity per se. This is the non-duality of emptiness and form, as the Buddhists put it, or spirit and matter, as some others put it, or Shiva and Shakti, as some tantrikas put it. And I want to establish, first of all, these are the same. These are just different ways of talking about the same non-duality: emptiness and form, spirit and matter, Shiva and Shakti. So this is perhaps the most surprising non-duality of all, because the two that appear to be two are so radically different. What could be different from emptiness and form? Emptiness, or pure spirit, or pure consciousness, or transcendent Shiva. And some of these ways of labeling it overlap, of course, with the notion of God in some of these traditions, but they need not. The Buddhist concept of emptiness doesn't exactly overlap with the concept of God. But however we phrase it, we're talking about something that's absolutely unparticularized, which has it's not detectable by any of the 5 or 6 senses, and yet it's that which makes possible everything, because formless consciousness is the context within which all form appears. Okay, so most people could get on board with that in one way or another and say, yeah, I see that from the first person perspective of any conscious being, formless awareness is that in which all form appears. And then we discover it's that out of which all form is made. Back to that subject-object non-duality, right? So therefore, that which is supremely empty of particularity, empty of anything you could put your finger on, what we could also call formless presence, what we could also call transcendent Shiva, is inextricable from form, because in fact it appears as all the forms. So it's formlessness that appears as form, it's nothingness that appears as something, or at least as the appearance of something. It is transcendent Shiva that takes form as Shakti. Okay, now I acknowledge here that there are definitely going to be some Buddhists who disagree with equating emptiness with Shiva, formless consciousness, pure spirit in this way. And indeed, there's different versions in Buddhism of what emptiness means, because for philosophical Buddhists, emptiness is just a way of talking about the interdependence of all things. It's a way of talking about the fact that nothing has its own essence, that there aren't separate essences, right? That in fact all reality is interdependent and therefore empty of its own essence. Each object is empty of its own essence. But there's also another version of emptiness, which we see in Tantric Buddhism, where shunyata means this formless presence that makes possible all form, right? That we could, see an identity in some Buddhist lineages of emptiness and Rigpa and Samantabhadra and so on. So just acknowledging that this is a lineage-based issue, whether these concepts can be equated or not. But in the Heart Sutra, which is a Mahayana Buddhist text, we find emptiness is form and form is emptiness. So that's prior to Buddhist Tantra. So they're not equating emptiness with formless presence, pure consciousness. But my point is that whether you do make such an equation or not, it still holds true that emptiness and form are two aspects of one thing, not two different things. Each needs the other, each demands the other, necessitates the other, and is interdependent with the other. Okay, so there are, other forms of non-duality, but these are the main ones, these four that I've talked about. But there's also misunderstandings about non-duality. That is to say, some people think non-duality means there's no difference between good and bad, right and wrong. Well, you can sort of make that argument on the basis of the fact that good and bad and right and wrong are mental constructs held by humans. They're not things inscribed in nature itself. However, none of the authorities that taught non-duality in Asian religious history made this argument that non-duality means there's no difference between good and bad. Some of them acknowledge that good and bad is a mental construct created by humans for good reasons, for good human reasons, right? And sometimes misused, of course. But there's no point in arguing for a non-duality of things which are merely mental constructs, which don't exist in themselves, you see? So we don't argue for a non-duality in these traditions of good and bad. We say that there's such a thing as beneficial and there's such a thing as harmful. That's real. How do we define that? Well, the maximizing the well-being of conscious creatures, that's what we mean by beneficial. And in everyday language, we just call that good. Now, that's imprecise and it's judgmental, and so it would be much better to say beneficial. And harmful is those actions and ideas which decrease the well-being of conscious creatures, which in everyday life we just tend to call bad. But we need to examine these concepts, of course, and say, is this really beneficial? And is that really harmful? And if so, in what context? And is there another context in which it's not? It might even become the opposite one of this polarity. But that doesn't imply that we can argue that good and bad, right and wrong are meaningless distinctions. That's just an idiotic argument made by only the truly immature, to be honest. Nor do we argue that pleasure and pain is a meaningless distinction. We don't argue for a non-duality of pleasure and pain, even though both are, in some sense, illusory. Not while you're having them, usually, but they're ultimately seen to be simply modes of consciousness, and not properties of things or of selves. Okay, so that's a little bit about what non-duality is not, and this video is already longer than I thought, so I'll leave it there and see you next time. Take care, everyone. Be well. Om.